It was a bustling afternoon on Flight 378 from New York to Atlanta, and the atmosphere in the cabin was a mix of anticipation and routine. Passengers were settling into their seats, overhead bins clicked shut, and the faint hum of engines filled the air. Amid the typical travel chaos, a moment of serenity seemed to fall, until an incident broke the calm and captured the attention of everyone on board. Nina Carter, a seasoned flight attendant known for her no-nonsense demeanor, walked briskly down the aisle. Her crisp uniform and sharp gaze commanded respect, or so she thought. Today was like any other day for Nina, except for one passenger who caught her eye. He was a man in his early 30s, dressed in a tailored gray suit, his briefcase neatly tucked under the seat in front of him. His calm presence seemed out of place in the midst of the usual pre-flight commotion. This man was Eric Daniels, a prominent civil rights attorney who had just wrapped up a high-profile case in New York. Eric was the kind of person who exuded quiet confidence. With his earbuds in and a paperback book in hand, he was prepared for an uneventful flight, but fate had other plans. The tension began innocuously enough. Nina noticed Eric's arm resting slightly on the shared armrest. A minor, almost trivial infraction by most standards, but for Nina, who prided herself on maintaining impeccable order, it was an issue she couldn't overlook. She approached him with a sharp tone that turned heads. "Sir, I need you to move your arm," she said curtly, her words cutting through the cabin noise like a blade. Eric looked up, momentarily startled, and removed one earbud. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. "I said, move your arm," Nina repeated, this time louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Eric's brows furrowed slightly. "I'm not sure what the problem is," he said calmly, keeping his composure. "Is there something wrong?" To Nina, his calmness felt like defiance. She leaned closer, her voice dropping but still sharp. "I don't have time to argue, just do as I say." The interaction might have ended there, a fleeting moment of friction lost in the shuffle of air travel. But Nina's patience was thin, and Eric's refusal to comply immediately, though perfectly reasonable, ignited a spark. The exchange escalated when Eric, maintaining his calm, politely asked, "Can you explain why this is necessary?" It was the kind of question that challenged authority, and Nina didn't take it lightly. Her voice rose again, and passengers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Are you refusing to cooperate with the flight crew?" she demanded, her tone accusatory. Eric sighed, clearly wanting to avoid further conflict. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to understand what's going on here. There's no need for hostility." But before he could say more, Nina's frustration boiled over. In a shocking turn of events, she raised her hand and slapped him. The sound reverberated through the cabin, silencing every conversation, every cough, every shuffle of feet. Gasps erupted from passengers, and a collective tension filled the air as all eyes turned toward the commotion. Eric sat frozen for a moment, his face a mix of shock and disbelief. A murmur swept through the cabin as passengers whispered among themselves. Some fumbled for their phones, ready to record what had just unfolded. And then slowly Eric stood up. His imposing stature and calm demeanor commanded attention, and his voice, though measured, carried a weight that silenced even the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, addressing the cabin with the authority of someone used to standing before a jury. "I'd like everyone here to bear witness to what just happened. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and I will not let it go unchecked." The passengers, many of whom had been passive observers up until that moment, began to voice their support. One woman near the back exclaimed, "You can't treat people like that," while another passenger called for the captain to intervene. As the uproar grew, Nina's initial confidence faltered. She looked around, realizing that the tide had turned against her. Eric, still composed but visibly determined, reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "You've just assaulted me," he said evenly, handing the card to a fellow passenger who had recorded the incident. "And I intend to make sure this is addressed." The flight, which had started as just another routine trip, had now become a stage for a moment of accountability. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, asking for calm, but the energy in the cabin was electric. Nina's actions, which she had expected to be swept under the rug, were now under the scrutiny of dozens of witnesses, and soon the entire world. As the plane taxied back to the gate, passengers exchanged glances and words of support for Eric, whose unwavering composure had turned him into an unexpected hero. What would happen next was anyone's guess, but one thing was clear: Nina's day was about to take a turn she could never have anticipated. As the plane idled near the gate, the energy inside the cabin felt heavy. No one moved except for a few passengers who exchanged quiet, uneasy glances. The ripple effect of what had just happened continued to grow, stretching through the rows like static electricity. Some clutched their phones tightly, eyes flicking between the screen and Eric as if waiting for the next part of the story to unfold. Eric remained standing, his presence filling the small space between seats. His calm exterior didn't betray the frustration simmering just below the surface. He hadn't raised his voice once, yet there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere, like the calm before a storm. Across the aisle, Nina stood rigid, her arms crossed over her chest. A gaze flickered nervously toward the front of the plane where the captain would no doubt appear any moment. The self-assured authority she once held seemed to slip through her fingers like sand. Passengers began to speak in hushed tones. "Did you see that?" Someone whispered from behind. "That was insane. She really just hit him." Another voice murmured. Eric lowered himself back into his seat, but not before offering a small reassuring nod to the passengers watching him closely. He didn't want to escalate the situation further, at least not now. Timing was everything, and he understood that better than most. He wasn't just any passenger, he was someone who spent his career holding people accountable. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket. Pulling it out, he glanced at the screen. A message from his colleague Marcus flashed across the display. "How's the flight? Land yet?" Eric hesitated for a moment before replying. "Delayed. Some complications." The words felt like an understatement, but Eric didn't feel the need to elaborate, at least not yet. Marcus would get the full story soon enough. Nina meanwhile retreated toward the galley at the front of the plane. A younger flight attendant named Claire, who had been quietly handling drink orders, watched her return with wide eyes. Claire hadn't witnessed the full exchange, but had caught enough to know something was wrong. "What happened?" Claire whispered as Nina brushed past her. "Nothing," Nina snapped, tightening her ponytail. "Passengers are being difficult, that's all." Claire frowned but didn't press further. A few rows back, an older woman with graying hair leaned toward Eric. She spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "I've been flying for 30 years, she said. "Never seen anything like that." Eric glanced at her, offering a small, appreciative smile. "Neither have I," he replied softly. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "I hope you report her." Eric didn't respond immediately, but his silence spoke volumes. The minutes dragged on, stretching out longer than they should have. The captain eventually emerged from the cockpit, his expression carefully neutral. He walked down the aisle, stopping near Eric's seat. "Sir," the captain began, addressing Eric directly, "I was informed of an incident. Is everything all right?" Eric stood again, shaking the captain's hand with a firm grip. "I'm fine, but I'd like to discuss this further when we land," he said, keeping his tone level. "I'm sure your crew can provide the details." The captain nodded, casting a brief glance toward Nina, who stood by the galley, avoiding eye contact. "Of course, I appreciate your patience." Eric could see it in the captain's eyes, the tightrope he was walking. No pilot wanted drama mid-flight, but this wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Eric settled back into his seat. Across the aisle, a man in a baseball cap leaned over, lowering his voice. "Man, I got the whole thing on video," he whispered, holding up his phone just enough for Eric to see the paused recording. Eric nodded. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "Hold on to that, just in case." The man smiled. "No problem. People need to see this kind of stuff." Eric turned his attention to the window, watching as airport personnel moved outside on the tarmac. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the concrete. The wait stretched longer than expected, and soon murmurs of impatience rippled through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing toward the front of the plane for some indication of movement. Claire returned with a tray of water, moving quietly through the rows. When she reached Eric's seat, she hesitated for a moment before offering him a glass. "I'm sorry about earlier," she said softly. "I didn't see everything, but it shouldn't have happened." Eric met her eyes, sensing the sincerity in her voice. "Thank you," he replied. "I appreciate that." She lingered for just a second longer before continuing down the aisle, offering drinks to other passengers. Nina remained out of sight for most of the delay, likely biding her time in the galley. When she did reappear, her gaze skimmed over the passengers quickly, avoiding prolonged eye contact. Eric's mind lingered on the incident. As much as he wanted to let it go and focus on the book he'd been reading, he couldn't shake the lingering sense of injustice. The slap had been unexpected, sure, but it wasn't just the physical act that stuck with him. It was the principle, the blatant misuse of authority, the way Nina had assumed she could behave without consequence. He wasn't the kind of person to let things slide, not when there were people watching, people who needed to know that standing up for themselves mattered. Eric leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. The hum of the engines, the soft murmur of conversation. It all blended together, but his thoughts stayed sharp. The plane finally began taxiing down the runway, the captain's voice reassuring passengers that they would make up for lost time in the air. Yet the energy in the cabin hadn't returned to normal. Eric could feel it. The quiet tension, the unspoken understanding that what had happened wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the plane gained altitude, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the long stretch in the air. Eric shifted in his seat, adjusting the book on his lap, though his focus was far from the pages. The slap still echoed faintly in his mind, not as a sound but as a reminder, an unspoken challenge that lingered with every breath. The other passengers hadn't forgotten either. Every so often, Eric caught their glances, subtle nods, or hushed conversations behind him. The man in the baseball cap across the aisle occasionally fiddled with his phone, like he were replaying the video he captured. He made no effort to hide the satisfied look on his face, as if he knew he held something important. Eric wondered how long it would take before the video surfaced online. Nina had resumed her duties, though she carried herself differently now. Her walk wasn't as brisk, and her eyes avoided the rows where Eric and the others sat. When she passed by, she barely slowed down, delivering drinks or snacks with minimal interaction. It was as if she believed that faster she moved, the sooner the incident would fade. But it wouldn't. Eric could feel it growing, not just for him, but for the entire cabin. The imbalance, the weight of injustice that hung in the air was impossible to ignore. Even those who hadn't witnessed the slap seemed to sense that something had shifted. A soft ding sounded overhead, signaling that the seatbelt sign had been turned off. A few passengers stood to stretch or use the restroom, but Eric remained seated, glancing toward the front where Nina lingered by the galley, speaking quietly to Claire. Claire nodded along, though her body language seemed uncertain, half turned toward Nina, half toward the passengers behind her. Eric wondered what Nina was telling her. The thought crossed his mind that she might be downplaying the situation or twisting the details, as people often did when backed into a corner. He'd had seen it countless times in court, defendants reshaping the truth to fit their narrative. But here, there were too many witnesses. No amount of words could erase what had happened in plain sight. Eric's thoughts were interrupted when a soft voice spoke beside him. "Excuse me." He turned to find the older woman who had commented earlier. She leaned slightly across the aisle, her voice lowered. "I don't mean to intrude, but are you all right?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. Eric offered a small smile. "I'm fine, thank you." She hesitated, as if weighing her next words carefully. "I hope you follow through with this. People need to see that you can't just let things like that happen." Eric nodded thoughtfully. "I intend to," he replied. "No one should feel they can get away with that." Her gaze lingered for a moment longer before she returned to her seat, satisfied by his response. The rest of the flight passed slowly, but the energy in the cabin never fully settled. Eric found his eyes drawn to the window more often than not, watching the clouds stretch endlessly beneath them. Despite the stillness outside, his mind continued to race. When the plane finally began its descent, the mood shifted once again. Passengers stirred in their seats, the quiet hum of conversation picking up as the cabin prepared for landing. Eric straightened his suit jacket, preparing for the moment the plane touched down. As the wheels met the runway with a soft thud, Nina's voice echoed over the intercom, thanking the passengers for flying with them. Her tone was steady, but Eric couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in her words. She was aware of what awaited her once the doors opened. The plane taxied to the gate, and as soon as the seatbelt sign flickered off, phones lit up across the cabin. People stretched, retrieved bags, and prepared to disembark. But Eric remained seated, watching as the line formed toward the exit. Nina positioned herself near the door, offering forced smiles and brief farewells to the passengers as they passed. Some nodded politely, others simply walked by without acknowledgement. The man in the baseball cap made a point to stop, meeting Nina's gaze directly as he exited. "Good luck," he said, his tone pointed, before disappearing down the jet bridge. When it was finally Eric's turn, he approached the front slowly. Nina's eyes met his briefly before flickering away. "Have a nice day," she said softly, the words feeling more like an afterthought. Eric paused just long enough to let the silence linger, then stepped forward without responding. As he crossed the threshold, the weight of the moment hung between them, unresolved but not forgotten. The terminal was bright and bustling with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures. Eric retrieved his briefcase, weaving through the crowd, but even as he stepped out into the cool airport air, the story wasn't over. He knew that this was just the beginning. Eric stepped into the airport terminal, but his mind wasn't on the usual post-flight rituals of finding transportation or checking messages. His eyes swept the crowd, catching fragments of conversations and hurried footsteps, but his focus kept circling back to the small, unfolding drama he left behind on the plane. Even here, the tension from the cabin seemed to follow. Passengers from the flight clustered in loose groups near the baggage claim, their voices low but animated. Eric didn't need to eavesdrop to know what they were discussing. He noticed the man in the baseball cap leaning against a pillar, phone in hand, likely crafting the post that would send the video out to the world. Eric's steps slowed as he passed him, but the man caught his glance and gave a subtle nod. "It'll be up in 5 minutes," he said without looking up. Eric wasn't sure if he should feel relieved or uneasy. While he believed in holding people accountable, he also knew how unpredictable the internet could be. Situations like this had a way of snowballing, morphing into something beyond the control of those involved. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he glanced at the screen. An email notification from his firm. Business as usual. But just as he was about to put it away, another message popped up, this time from an unknown number. "So what happened? If you need a witness, I'm here." Eric paused, glancing around instinctively. He didn't recognize the number, but judging by the timing, it had to be someone from the flight. The feeling of being watched crawled under his skin, but he couldn't deny the strange comfort the message brought. Before he could respond, the crowd near baggage claim grew louder. Eric shifted his attention back to the scene just as Nina emerged from the jet bridge, trailing behind Claire and another attendant. Her face was set in that carefully crafted calm, but there was no hiding the stiffness in her posture or the way her eyes darted around the terminal. She saw the clusters of passengers, and for the briefest moment, Eric caught the flicker of unease cross her face. Claire leaned in, whispering something to Nina that drew a quick nod. They were heading toward the staff exit, clearly hoping to avoid any direct confrontation. But the attempt to slip away unnoticed was failing. One of the passengers, a younger woman who had sat near the back, stepped forward, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Is no one going to address what happened back there?" Her voice carried a sharp edge, and heads turned. Nina's steps faltered, but Claire pressed forward, quickening her pace. Nina hesitated for half a second before following. Eric stayed rooted, watching as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. The younger woman crossed her arms, clearly unsatisfied. Eric recognized the look, the simmering frustration of someone unwilling to let injustice slide. The baseball cap man glanced up from his phone, letting out a soft chuckle. "It's catching fire already," he muttered. Eric debated for a moment before stepping toward the staff exit. He wasn't chasing a confrontation, but something about Nina's attempt to fade into the background didn't sit right. As he approached, Nina and Claire disappeared around the corner, but Eric kept his pace steady, not rushing, but not stopping either. By the time he turned the corner, they were further down the hallway, walking briskly toward an unmarked door. Eric slowed, giving them distance, but he didn't miss the glance Nina cast over her shoulder. She knew he was there. Just as her hand reached for the door handle, Eric spoke, his voice low but firm. "Nina." She froze. Claire paused beside her, eyes flicking between them. For a moment, the hallway fell silent except for the distant hum of airport activity. Nina's shoulders straightened, but she didn't turn around. "You don't have to run from this," Eric said, taking a step closer. "I think you know that." Nina's grip on the handle tightened, and for a moment, Eric thought she might walk through the door anyway. But then she exhaled, a quiet sigh that barely reached him, and slowly turned. Her expression was guarded, but there was something else too. Fatigue, maybe, or the realization that the situation was far from over. "I'm not running," she replied softly. Eric met her gaze, steady but not confrontational. "Then don't hide. You're going to have to face this sooner or later. Better to get ahead of it now." Claire shifted uncomfortably beside Nina, clearly wanting to intervene but holding back. Nina's eyes flickered toward the end of the hallway where the terminal buzzed with life. For a moment, she seemed to weigh Eric's words carefully, as if mentally calculating the fallout of every possible path. "I wasn't thinking," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "It just happened." Eric nodded. "I believe that, but that doesn't mean people will forget." She looked down briefly, hands clasping in front of her. Claire placed a gentle hand on Nina's arm, a silent show of support. Eric took a step back, giving them space. Whatever happens next, it's not too late to make it right, he added. Nina didn't respond immediately, but something in her expression softened, the mask slipping just slightly. As Eric turned to leave, he caught the faintest murmur from Claire. "You should talk to the captain before this gets worse." Nina nodded, and Eric walked away, knowing the next few hours would reveal whether or not she took that advice. Eric made his way back toward the terminal, but something about the exchange lingered in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than Nina let on. As he rejoined the crowd near baggage claim, the murmurs had grown louder, and he caught snippets of conversation, passengers speculating about what might happen next. Some were sympathetic, others less so. The man with the baseball cap was still there leaning against the same pillar, but his phone was now buzzing with notifications. He glanced at the screen and let out a low whistle. "It's blowing up faster than I thought," he said, catching Eric's eye. Someone must have sent it to a news outlet already. Eric frowned, his gaze drifting toward the exit where Nina had disappeared moments earlier. He couldn't imagine what it felt like knowing that a moment of frustration, one she probably already regretted, was spreading across the internet at this speed. But something still didn't sit right. He was about to turn away when he noticed a uniformed man near the gate, speaking to one of the flight attendants from their plane. The attendant, a younger man Eric recalls seeing during the flight, looked nervous. His eyes darted around the terminal as if searching for someone. Eric recognized the pattern immediately. He'd seen it countless times in court, someone caught in the middle of something bigger than they anticipated. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped closer, catching part of their conversation. "Just disappeared right after landing," the flight attendant was saying, voice hushed but urgent. "We thought she went to the crew lounge, but she's not there." The uniformed man, likely a supervisor, crossed his arms, his brows furrowing. That's not like her, especially after an incident like this. Eric's attention sharpened. He had assumed Nina was lying low somewhere behind the scenes, avoiding the growing crowd of frustrated passengers. But if she hadn't gone to the crew lounge, where had she gone? The supervisor sighed and pulled out his phone, stepping away as he dialed. The flight attendant lingered a moment longer, shifting uneasily before finally heading back toward the gate. Eric stood there for a beat, debating whether to follow up or let it go. Logic told him it wasn't his business. He had done more than enough by offering Nina a chance to explain herself. But instinct, that gut feeling that rarely led him astray, told him otherwise. He turned and scanned the terminal. If Nina wasn't in the lounge, there weren't many other places she could have gone without drawing attention. The only exits nearby led either to the main terminal floor or a restricted area for staff. His eyes narrowed on a side door just past the baggage claim, a discreet entry marked "Authorized Personnel Only." It stood slightly ajar. Eric crossed the terminal, weaving through clusters of passengers until he reached the door. He hesitated for a brief second, then slipped inside. The hallway beyond was quiet, the sterile lighting humming softly. A faint echo of footsteps trailed somewhere further down, but as Eric advanced, the sound faded. A soft click caught his attention. He rounded the corner just in time to see the handle of another door easing shut. Eric's pulse quickened. He approached carefully, pausing just outside. He knocked lightly. "Nina." Silence. Eric waited, listening for any sign of movement. "I know you're in there." His tone was gentle but firm. After a long pause, the door opened just enough for him to see her. Nina stood inside, her posture tense. The room behind her appeared to be a storage space, dimly lit and cluttered with spare uniforms and travel bags. "I needed a minute," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. Eric nodded. "I get that. But you disappearing like this is only going to make things worse." Her eyes flickered with hesitation, but then she stepped aside, allowing him into the cramped space. "I wasn't trying to run," she murmured as he entered. I needed to be alone for a second." Eric studied her carefully. There was something else beneath the surface. Anxiety, yes, but also a flicker of fear. "What's really going on?" he asked gently. Nina hesitated, her hand fidgeting with the edge of a nearby shelf. "Claire told me to wait for the captain, but something felt off." She danced toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. Eric frowned. "Off how?" Nina hesitated, then finally met his gaze. "I overheard something before the flight. Claire was talking to one of the passengers in first class. I didn't think much of it at the time, but after everything that happened, I keep replaying it in my head." Eric's expression hardened slightly. "What did they say?" Nina's voice dropped to a near whisper. "They mentioned you by name." Eric's eyes narrowed as Nina's words hung in the air. The room felt smaller, the weight of that single revelation pressing down between them. "They mentioned me," he repeated slowly, as if he needed to hear it again to believe it. Nina nodded, her fingers tightening around the edge of the shelf. "I didn't catch the whole conversation, but Claire said something about you being on the flight list." She seemed nervous, almost like she was trying to calm him down. Eric's pulse quickened, the pieces shifting in his mind. He thought back to the man in first class, the one who kept shooting glances his way during boarding. He dismissed it as coincidence, but now, with Nina's confession, it didn't feel so random. Nina's gaze flicked toward the door again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything. Claire's been acting strange since we landed. She's avoiding everyone." Eric exhaled slowly, the picture coming together. It wasn't just about the incident with Nina. There was something bigger at play, and he had walked right into it without realizing. "Where's Claire now?" he asked. "I don't know. Last I saw, she was talking to airport security, but she left right after. I think she's still somewhere in the terminal." Eric glanced at the door. The terminal wasn't huge. She couldn't have gone far. If Claire was involved in whatever this was, he needed to find her. "Nina, listen," he said, his tone calm but serious. "I need you to stay here. Don't leave this room until I come back. Can you do that for me?" Her eyes searched his face, but she nodded. "Okay." Eric gave her a reassuring nod before stepping out of the storage room and back into the hallway. The terminal buzzed with its usual activity, but beneath it, he could feel the undercurrent of something else, tension just below the surface. His eyes scanned the crowd, and then he spotted her. Claire, standing near one of the side gates, speaking quietly with a man in a dark suit. Eric recognized him immediately. He was the same man who had been seated near the front of the plane. Eric's footsteps quickened, weaving through the throng of passengers until he was close enough to hear their conversation. "I told you it was handled," Claire was saying, her voice low but firm. "There's no need to escalate it." The man's expression darkened. "It's already escalated." He knows something's off. Eric's presence seemed to catch them off guard. Claire's eyes widened as she noticed him approaching, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Mr. Lawson," she greeted, her tone overly polite. "Is there something I can help you with?" Eric crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "I think you already know why I'm here." Claire's smile faltered for just a second, but the man beside her shifted, subtly positioning himself between them. "Eric, I think you're misunderstanding the situation." Claire began, but Eric held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Save it. I know you've been watching me since we boarded. I just want to know why." The man's eyes narrowed, but Claire hesitated, glancing around nervously. Finally, she leaned in, lowering her voice. "It wasn't personal," she admitted. "We were given instructions to keep an eye on you during the flight. There were concerns, but nothing we thought would lead to this." Eric's jaw tightened. "Concerns from who?" Claire exchanged a brief glance with the man, but before she could answer, a new voice cut in from behind. "You're asking the wrong person." Eric turned, finding himself face to face with the captain of the flight, his uniform crisp, but his expression unreadable. "I requested the security measure," the captain continued. "We received a tip-off before takeoff that someone matching your description had been involved in sensitive legal cases. Certain parties were uneasy." Eric stared at him, the realization sinking in. This wasn't about Nina. It wasn't even about Claire. It was about him. Someone from one of his past cases had been spooked enough to put eyes on him during the flight. "So you let Claire stir things up instead?" Eric asked, his voice tight. The captain's gaze didn't waver. "I didn't expect things to unfold this way, but you understand how these things work." Eric's hands clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to relax. This wasn't the time to press further. Not yet. "Fine," he said evenly. "But next time, maybe just ask me directly. It would save everyone a lot of trouble." Claire's shoulders sagged with relief, and the captain gave a small nod before stepping back. As Eric walked away, the weight of what had just unfolded still sat heavily in his chest. There were questions left unanswered, but for now, he had enough. Nina was still waiting when he returned, her eyes searching his face for answers. "It's over," Eric assured her. "For now." She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing. "Thank you for stepping in." Eric offered a small smile. "Let's just say I'm used to messy situations." As they left the storage room and re-entered the crowded terminal, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to get ahead of him. But for now, the storm had passed.